Hello and welcome to the National Museum of Women in the Arts virtual program, Curator's Perspective Remix. I'm Gabby Awuma, the Senior Membership Manager at NMWA. Thank you for joining us for this special virtual presentation by Senior Curator Jenny Trainer, Associate Curator Aureen Zara, and Assistant Curator Hannah Shambrome. Tonight you'll hear from our curators as they discuss the recent updates and the new works on view in Remix, the collection. This exhibition was sponsored by Lugano Diamonds, with additional funding provided by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Sue J. Henry and Carter G. Phillips Exhibition Fund, and the Clara M. Lovett Emerging Artists Fund. Sorry about that. I think I cut off on the sponsorships, but those are our main sponsors for the exhibition. I apologize for anyone that I miss. But also, I just want to say thank you to our sponsors of the exhibition. We really appreciate their generous support of Remix. And I also want to say thank you to our members and supporters of the museum in attendance. We could not champion women in the arts without your support and dedication to the museum. And so before we begin our presentation, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature to share your questions for our speakers. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible before the event concludes at 7. Now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Aureen, who will kick off our presentations.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you to everyone joining us this evening. And as I begin to talk a little bit about how we organize our collection, yes, thank you, Gabby, for putting up the presentation. So here at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, we organize our collection thematically in lieu of a chronological layout. And that is predominantly to break down certain hierarchies that have existed in art history for generations, where historical paintings, sculpture, drawings by artists from Europe and America have typically been privileged. They've typically been placed at the beginning or in front of an exhibition. And contemporary artists from outside Europe and America, later artists, modern artists, or artists who work with mixed media, anyone really outside of those hierarchical medium of painting, drawing, and sculpture, people working in new media technologies, they're usually relegated to the back or the end of the exhibition. So rather than think of art history in this linear way that privileges a gendered Euro-American viewpoint, we have decided to mix it all up. We place historical next to contemporary. We place painting and ceramics and textiles near installation work and photography. We place artists from across time periods and cultural borders in conversation with each other. As you'll see as we go through these presentations, but also as you look at this image in front of you. And it makes for really interesting stories about what artists are reflecting on throughout history, right? What are the differences in their thinking, but also what are some of the common threads? And there are more commonalities than you might realize. When we reopened our doors in October of 2023 after our renovation, we had brand new themes in an ongoing presentation of the collection that we call Remix. In this new iteration of Remix that Jenny, Hannah, and I will present to you, the themes are the same as before. But because of light sensitivity and the need to rest our works on paper, we have now rotated out all of our photographs, prints, and drawings in the galleries. So if you've previously visited NMWA in the last year or so, our galleries now might look quite different to you. And one of those themes, if you go to the next slide, Gabby, that looks really different is this section called Photo Credit. Photo Credit features highlights of photography from NMWA's collection. This entire section, because photographs are works on paper, has been rotated out. And because so many women were at the forefront of photography since the late 19th century, we're lucky enough that there are a lot of existing examples of work by women working in this medium. And photography is actually one of the fastest growing parts of our collection. And this rotation enables us to highlight some more of those gems. If you stick to Sam Taylor Johnson for a second, so we could talk a little bit more about this work. And you may know Sam Taylor Johnson currently as a filmmaker and as her in her, scene on in Hollywood. But she was also a prominent presence in the visual art scene since the 1990s. She was a part of the YBA, the Young British Artists, which were a group of emerging radical artists exhibiting together in London starting in the late 80s. This work in front of you is part of Taylor Johnson's Escape Artist series, where we see her levitating just above the ground, and it looks like she's floating and hovering with the help of these colorful balloons. In reality, she's being held up by ropes, and she has gone back and digitally manipulated the image to erase the ropes. Now, this series represents an emotionally significant time in her life when she was recovering from cancer. And she said she began this work when she could finally stop referring to herself as an ill person, as ill. She was diagnosed with colon cancer in 1997 and breast cancer in 2000. So there's a literal lightness in this image, right? She's literally levitating. She's feeling as her healed body floats. And the title Escape Artist and the image of her levitating also has a suggestion, a connotation of something magical, a magic trick or a miracle. The colorful balloons enhance that idea of freedom or liberation from illness, of rejoicing, celebration of life. But that dark background against which she floats is a stark reminder of the suffering that she has endured and from which she has survived. So every single work from this series is the same. She floats with these balloons in slightly different positions. Sometimes she's in this orientation. Sometimes she's on her back, facing upwards. Sometimes they're just some balloons tied to her feet. So each one, sometimes the balloons are different colors. So each one is slightly different, but they're all against this dark background. And the other thing that is the same throughout this series of escape artists is that we never fully see her face. Sometimes we can see maybe a profile of her face, but it's still largely obscured. And she says in an interview, I have to hide my face in the pictures. It is a combination of hiding the grimacing pain, because I think that destroys the photograph, but it is also because I don't think you need to see my face. And what I think she's getting at is that this is not meant to be a portrait, a representation of her. This is an image about feeling something, right? It shows a heightened emotional state for the artist, but also for her viewers who have experienced something like this or have seen loved ones experience this kind of hardship. And one of the things I've tried to do in this photography section is show figures and bodies that haven't always been privileged in art history. Because the image of women as youthful, idealized, and compliant have been perpetuated time and time again, but we haven't often seen images like this of women facing illness and grief. Or if you go to the next slide, we haven't really seen images of really strong, powerful, aging bodies. So here we have an example by Kirsten Justesen, who has been a pivotal figure in Danish art history and feminist art history since the 70s and 80s. Her art practice embraces sculpture, set design, as well as education and political activism. So in 1980, Justesen lived in Greenland, where she constantly saw icebergs as part of the natural landscape there. She became fascinated with the way icebergs came in all shapes and sizes. They floated around, they broke apart, they melted, they ultimately disappeared. And this led her to start thinking about the metamorphosis of a medium, right? And how a material has the ability to change form over time. And this is when she really began to work with ice as a primary medium as a way to explore that idea of metamorphosis even further. So Justesen in these photographs positions her own body onto these blocks or these plinths of ice. She's only wearing rubber boots and gloves. As somebody who hates the cold, that sounds like a nightmare, but she's doing it like a rock star, and she's letting the ice blocks melt over time, but also through the warmth and heat of her body. And then when the blocks eventually melt, she takes those puddles and then she refreezes them, and in a sense, giving this medium new life. So her photographs record this repetitive process of transition from solid to liquid back to solid. In other words, that idea of metamorphosis and capturing this idea of mutability and impermanence of the worlds, right? So she's exploring this idea that nothing is permanent. The world around us is ever changing. And when she began working with ice in the 80s, she wasn't necessarily thinking about environmentalism. Because as I mentioned, she was thinking about the relationship between her body and the medium over passage of time. But over the years, she herself has admitted and recognized how like our collective growing consciousness about climate change has led to people interpreting her works through the lens of ecological concerns, and that her works can be seen through this context. So the melting pedestals have been read as evoking glacial thawing caused by global warming and the melting of the Arctic, the sea coasts, the disappearance of entire terrains. Her nakedness in these images also alludes to human exposure to the effects of climate change. And it's also been pointed out how the pairing of the melting ice with human flesh suggests this mutual vulnerability of both planet and people, right? So both the planet's vulnerable, but also human beings are vulnerable as a result of climate change. So if we look at it from the 80s point of view, when she began working, these works really defied a gendered expectation of quote unquote what a woman's art is supposed to be. But now in the present day, it's also taken on this renewed resonance in light of the climate crisis. Next slide, please, Gabby. So from conceptual photography, I want to give a couple of examples of documentary photography in the galleries, starting with Graciela Iturbide, who is one of the best-known photographers coming out of Latin America today and over the last several decades. She is really known for humanizing her sitters and depicting life in Mexico, but also beyond Mexico, with a sense of compassion and sensitivity towards her subject matter. So since the 1970s, Iturbide immersed herself in the indigenous communities that she photographed, including this community of Zapotec women in Juchitán. And Juchitán is a small city in the state of Oaxaca in southeastern Mexico. So in Zapotec culture, women are known for their economic, political, and sexual freedoms and independence. Women in Juchitán generally run the economy and manage and control the local outdoor markets. The Zapotec community also lives in close proximity to its animals. And that coexistence between the community and animals is a reminder of the importance of animal spirits in Juchitán folklore and beliefs, something that Iturbide tries to encapsulate through all of the images of her photographs of this community. She often playfully and artistically records women with iguanas, chickens, and fish for sale at the market, which again points to women's economic independence, but also to this important relationship between people and animals in the culture. This woman, this image shows a woman displaying fish for sale, not at the market, but from the private space of her residence, of her home. And we can see how Iturbide has echoed the scales of the fish, have reflected the scales of the fish with the clay and straw on the walls of the woman's house. And just revealing the variety of textures in this image, in spite of it being a black and white photograph. And Iturbide has really been a master of that idea of being able to show us surprising, unexpected details of an image. If you go to the next slide, this kind of image that you see on the left that Iturbide has done has become so iconic and representative of documentary photography coming out of Latin America and particularly Mexico, that I want to briefly mention this artist on the right, Daniela Russell, who is also a photographer born in Mexico City, but of a much younger generation than Iturbide. And Russell gives us a very different portrait of Mexico through her work. So rather than looking at indigenous communities, Russell gives us an insight into the nouveau riche class in Mexico City. The women in these photographs are often shown in a state of ennui. They look a little bored, a little distant, maybe a little annoyed. And they're often dressed like aspiring starlets, like you see here with this young woman in her tiara and her fur-lined coat. Often the domestic settings that they're in show garish, over-the-top furnishings. Sometimes they have huge stuffed taxidermied animals. It's generally kind of kitschy or tacky opulence. And we're almost not sure if these are intended to be social documents or if they're intended to be caricatures of this privileged class, of which the artist herself is a member, right? So she's not an outsider looking in, she's actually a part of that privileged class in Mexican society. So she's really merging the classical documentary photography that we see with Iturbide on the left with a modern take on the genre and really expanding on what is historically understood as Mexican documentary photography. And I include this comparison as a way to illustrate why we hang things thematically, because this allows us to have a fuller picture of a place and its diverse communities from a variety of perspectives. Um, and I'm also including these two images. I'm showing them for comparative purposes in the same kind of scale. But if you go to the next slide and you look at the left end wall there, you'll see the Iturbide next to the Russell. Now, Iturbide typically works in this small format photography. And Gabby, if you're able to point the mouse at the Iturbide and the Russell, Russell's image is almost, a photograph is almost 3 times bigger than Iturbide. Now, both of them have an equally compelling presence when you're in the galleries looking at them. But again, through these very different aesthetic and stylistic approaches, looking at life in Mexico, in a place that they both call home. So from photo, we're going to now go on to another theme called fiber optics, and Judy will tell us more about that.
Thank you, Irene. I don't know how I drew the short straw having to go after Irene because it's hard to match that. That was really fascinating, and I'm glad that you pointed out the scale of those photographs at the end because I think that's really important and something that doesn't always come across when we're presenting virtually like this. So we thought it was important to give our audience tonight these in situ images of the galleries, just so you get a sense of scale. So I'm going to talk about two works from this fiber optics section, and you can see them both in this picture. First one is the one directly in the center of the image, and then the second one I'm going to talk about is on the right-hand wall. So Gabby, if you want to go forward one. So this first work I want to talk about. Well, first, let me tell you a little bit about fiber optics. So this is one of our themes in our galleries, and it's all contemporary work, but you can't tell the story of women in art without talking about textiles from a historical perspective. Particularly, if we think of quote unquote traditional women's work, there's embroidery and crochet and quilting and lace making. And for a very long time, because those things were predominantly done by women, they weren't held in the same regard. They weren't valued equally as, let's say, painting and sculptures, things that were predominantly made by men. And so we try to, kind of pick apart these gender hierarchies a little bit in the installations that we have in our permanent collection. And so fiber optics is a way to talk about and demonstrate how contemporary artists are using textiles, fiber in various ways in their artwork. You're probably reading the description of this work that says acrylic collage and relief carving on wood panel and thinking, I don't see a lot of textile in there. And you would be right. There is actually no textile in this work, physical, literal textile. But as I talk about this work, I think you'll see why we wanted to include it. It's a little bit of a stretch, granted, but I think it also looks fabulous in the space. This is a work that we recently acquired. by Latoya Hobbs, who is an artist. She's originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, but she lives and works now in Baltimore, so not too far from where we are in Washington, D.C. And she teaches at MICA, which is the Maryland Institute College of Art up in Baltimore. And she's primarily a printmaker and a painter, and she's one of the co-founders of, or one of the founding members of Black Women of Print, which is an organization that aims to make visible the legacy of Black women printmakers, past, present, and future. And for this image, she's actually depicting another co-founder of that organization. Her name is Dr. Tanikia Harris, who along with Latoya Hobbs co-founded this organization to kind of promote and uplift and support Black women printmakers. Now it's interesting because this work is not actually a print. It is, in fact, what we call the matrix of a print. And the matrix means the block, whether it's a wood block or a copper plate or a linoleum tile that is carved into to then create the print. So this is actually the wooden block, and you saw in the picture before, it's actually quite large, that she's carved into. And then she's also collaged and painted on top of that. So the collage elements in this work are actually the jacket that she's wearing, the shirt, and her earring are all elements of collage. And so what Latoya Hobbs will do is she will use paper that she's found. Sometimes it has a print already on it, like the jacket is kind of like the stylized Japanese print. And once she affixes that to the surface, then she'll go back over it and paint on top of it to create depth and shadow and kind of those illusionistic qualities that you see, especially in the folds of the jacket. The pattern in the back, and then also what the sitter is wearing on her shirt, is the reason why we incorporated this into the fiber optic section. And the symbol of the circle within the star is known as Nosarama, and that is a symbol from the Adinkra system. I hope I'm saying that. Adinkra system of symbols that comes from the Akan people in Ghana. And it's a series of symbols that represent concepts, proverbs, aphorisms. And this one called Nosarama is carries the meaning of the children of the heavens or the children of the star. And the Adinkra symbols were traditionally and historically printed on textiles. And they would be used in, different ceremonial purposes, but also for decoration, different clothing and things like that. Latoya Hobbs has talked about, sometimes there's a very particular meaning associated with the kind of decorative patterns that she's using. Sometimes it's just what she happens to have on hand. And I don't know particularly for this piece if there is, a very particular resonance with this symbol Nosarama for this particular sitter. I haven't read anything about that. But I would guess that maybe there is, because that symbol is also echoed on the shirt that she's wearing. I wanted to give you a little bit of a detail. I'm sorry I didn't blow it up even more, so you could see some of the detail, particularly in the face of the sitter, because that is where the most of the carving into the wood block is. So it's really interesting that as a printmaker, a lot of Latoya Hobbs's work, like this one, are incorporating the techniques of printmaking, but are not in and of themselves prints. And in fact, this work has never had a print created from it. And she talks about, really having to determine early on in the process whether or not she's going to create prints from a matrix or not, because then it determines kind of the different processes that she uses. And I wanted to mention, and I think it's been put in the chat, that her work is also on view currently at the National Gallery of Art in the Elizabeth Catlett exhibition. And there's this wonderful kind of time-lapse film that the NGA created showing her work. It's really mesmerizing. I highly, highly recommend giving it a watch. Very short, but kind of her process from taking pictures of the sitter to transferring the sitter's likeness by drawing directly on to the matrix and then carving it out and printing it. And it's a really large print. A lot of her prints are really, really large. The first time I ever came across her work was at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And it was, sometimes you have those moments in museums where you turn a corner and you see something and you're just like, wow, this is great. And that's the experience I had with her massive, massive woodblock prints. Just incredible, incredible work. I think it's really fitting that her work is exhibited in the Catlett exhibition. The portrait that she created is actually of Catlett's granddaughter. So that's a lovely way to include kind of some of Elizabeth Catlett's family members, but also because LaToya Hobbs cites Elizabeth Catlett, as one of her inspirations. Elizabeth Catlett was a printmaker, born in Washington, D.C., actually, but lived and worked for a large portion of her life in Mexico, speaking of Mexico. And so, yeah, it's just, it's great. I think you come to D.C. and you can see not one, but two works by LaToya Hobbs on view. Okay, let's go to the next image. So this work is by an artist named Pasita Abad, and it's called One Night Stand, and it's actually from a series of works that she created over a long period of time that she called Endless Blues, excuse me. Pasita was born in the Philippines just after World War II. And left the country in about 1970 because of political unrest and political violence. Her parents were elected officials, and it came to a point where it was not safe for her to be in the country anymore. So she planned to go to Spain, where she was going to continue her studies. She had she graduated university studying law, and so she was going to continue her law studies in Spain. But while she was traveling there, she stopped in San Francisco to stay with an aunt, I believe, who lived in San Francisco. And she loved it so much that she decided that she would stay. So she never made it to Spain to study law. And it's lucky for us that she didn't, because there she embarked on this fantastic artistic career that encompassed traveling the globe multiple times, living in multiple countries, exhibiting in multiple countries. If there's ever such a thing as kind of a global citizen, I think Pasita Abad was that. She really took inspiration from her myriad travels, really interested in traditional techniques in the places where she was visiting, and always kind of incorporating these elements and thinking about these elements into her work. She met and married an American, Jack Garrity, while she was in San Francisco. And so the two of them traveled the world together, and they settled for a time in Washington, D.C. And so she took classes here in D.C. at the Corcoran School of Art. And she also took classes at the Art Students League in New York. As I mentioned, her artistic practice was really influenced by the travels, and she incorporated a lot of the traditional techniques she encountered in her travels. And I don't know if you can see it in the detail that I've put here. I was hoping that you could. But in this piece, and in a lot of her works from this period, she's incorporating batik fabric from Indonesia. And she spoke about being very intrigued by the kind of graphic qualities of the batik cloth that she saw. She actually stitched the pieces of batik cloth onto the canvas. So the kind of support here is a canvas, and you saw the size of it earlier. It's a large canvas. It's not stretched, meaning it's not on a frame. It's just kind of hanging free. And then she stitched these elements of batik fabric, these pieces of batik fabric onto the canvas. And then on top of that, she's gone back and painted. And I think this work is a really good example of kind of the energy of a lot of her work and the spirit of a lot of her work. She called herself an ambassador for color, right? All of her works are really just riots of color, of movement. I mean, they're almost vibrating. I think, she's really interested in the universality of art as a vehicle of expression, right? It surpasses language. It strikes people, on an emotional level first and foremost. And so many of her paintings exude this kind of joy for life, which unfortunately I never had the pleasure of meeting her, but all the pictures I've ever seen of her, she's just smiling so broadly. And she seems like she was a person that really just had a zest for life, had a joy for life, and that comes through her work. Having said that, this work, this part of the Endless Blue series was created, you'll notice the date, 2002. So it wasn't long after the attacks of September 11th in the United States. And so I think collectively this country was still kind of reeling from those attacks. And she talks about that, this kind of being a dark period because of that, but also because she had just received a very serious cancer diagnosis at this time. And so she was in her studio a lot. She wasn't able to travel because of her illness. And so she was in her studio listening to the blues playing over and over again. And she talks about, loving the blues from her early days in San Francisco and traveling around the country to see different blues artists playing, and finding a joy in the pain or a joy despite the pain. And that's really, I think, what this series in particular is about. Um, and she unfortunately, she passed away too soon, but she just had a posthumous monographic exhibition in 2023 that was at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and it traveled to SF MoMA PS1 in New York, and even to Canada, the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I believe still to date, it's the largest exhibition devoted to an Asian American woman artist. So really kind of a wonderful legacy that she's left. And now for the third work, we're gonna jump way back in time, and I'm going to give you another overview here of where it's hanging. So I'm going to be talking about the work in the gold frame on the right of the image you see here. So we can go on to the next image. And this is a painting by Claude Regé-Hurst called The Gentleman's Table from about 1890. Now you'll notice that Claude is usually a masculine name, and that is because Claude was born as Claudine, but she very purposefully changed her name sometime in the 1870s to Claude to be taken more seriously in the art world at the time. We're talking about, the 19th century, not the most gender equitable time in history. She was born in Cincinnati in 1855 as Claudine, as I mentioned, and enrolled in the McMicken School of Drawing and Design in Cincinnati, where she studied drawing, obviously, but also wood carving. And around 1880, she moved to New York City, and she took private art lessons from a number of artists there, and exhibited widely in New York and elsewhere, including Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston. So she was an artist that really, had a successful career for a woman at the time. And while her earlier works tend to be still lives of, let's say, a more feminine nature, she turned to, in the 1880s, she turned to doing these still lives that are kind of more masculine in nature. And these are still lives like the one you see here. And her male compatriots, her fellow male artists, were also doing still lives like this at the time. She really excelled in what is known as trompe l'oeil or fool the eye. So this really kind of hyper illusionistic way of painting. She was really one of the best to do this style of painting at that time. A lot of these masculine, quote unquote, masculine still lives will feature things like money, things kind of associated with the world of commerce and business, um, in a, kind of like, you know, typical like masculine, like rah rah, like we're these guys and we're great and we're, the robber barons of the Gilded Age and we're, making America great. She had a little bit of a different take. This painting, if you look closely, it's, we have playing cards, we have a pipe, we have bottles of wine, empty glasses. And, at first glance, it seems innocuous enough. But if you notice, most of the glasses are at least half drunk. The bottles of alcohol are empty. The cards kind of intimate maybe gambling, perhaps. So there's some really subtle undertones of critique in this painting, which is ironic because this painting was purchased for a men's club in Chicago in the late 19th century, a venue where presumably, not to be confused with a gentleman's club, but a men's club, like a social club. So presumably, things of this nature would be going on there. You bring your business companions to have a drink, to play some cards, to smoke a pipe, maybe talk business. But knowing that her own father was an alcoholic and her uncle actually died of alcoholism, specifically from absinthe, which was a very, very strong drink. And if you look at the left-hand side, you can see a glass with a spoon in it, and there's a sugar cube next to it and a lemon. Those are all kind of the accoutrement of absinthe drinking. And so, not to read too much of her biography into it, but I think that clearly she was not a fan, let's say, of alcohol consumption, particularly to this destructive degree. If you want to go to the next image, I just want to show again a detail just to give you a sense of her technique and her ability as a painter. I mean, sometimes you hear that term, a painter's painter. I think Hearst was definitely that. In oil, this is one of her largest paintings. She also worked in watercolor, and we have some tremendous watercolors by her that were on view, but we had to replace them because their work's on paper, so they're light sensitive. So we replaced it with the oil painting. But really did wonderful things in watercolor as well, and did a lot of similar still lives, a lot of books, glasses, like spectacle glasses, things like this. An artist who, was successful in her day. I think she painted into her 80s, so she had a long career, and I think is definitely ripe for rediscovery if you haven't discovered her already. And with that, I will pass things along to Hannah.
Thanks, Ginny. That was great. So I'm just going to share some works from one last section, and then I think we can kind of open things up to questions a little bit. But I'm going to share some recently hung works in our homemaker section. So this theme is sort of a little bit of a play on words, as you can probably see, exploring the idea that for many women, women artists in particular throughout history, they've had to kind of manage these dual roles as artists or makers, as well as domestic responsibilities, which historically and many times still to this day have fallen disproportionately on women. So some of the works on view depict this very directly, particularly some of the contemporary artists on view who confront and play on outdated stereotypes of women as homemakers, including Caroline Walker and Laurie Simmons, whose works you can see in the center, who I'll speak about in a moment. In other instances, we're showing objects made by women who are balancing these roles. You can see some the piece in the corner is by Honor Freeman, depicting Tupperware. There are also some silver works in this section as well. So it's a little bit of a mix of time periods of mediums, but the first artists and works that I'll talk about are by Caroline Walker. Walker is a Scottish painter. These two works, Sarah Wing Laurie 4 weeks and Sarah Wing Laurie 8 months, depict, as you can see, the same child in two different stages, both as newborn and then closer to 1 year. Walker is known for her portraits, particularly of women in the workforce, doing jobs that might sort of be less appreciated or their labor less acknowledged. So she's done a series of works depicting daycares and daycare providers, nail technicians, seamstresses. So also women in roles that might be stereotypically associated with, quote unquote, women's work. Her subjects are often people that she knows from her community, but sometimes they're strangers as well. And with these portraits, she's not exactly glorifying these women or these roles, but she is showing subjects and jobs that aren't often seen in this context of portraiture. And she's really sort of offering a window into the everyday lives of women, and in particular, the unseen labor that many women undertake. Her process for creating these paintings, they're based on her own documentary photographic source material. So, as I mentioned, she's often familiar with her subjects. So she'll frequently spend time sort of trailing them throughout their day, observing their lives, observing sort of their day-to-day habits and routines, and capturing photographs along the way to really kind of gain an understanding of what they do and how their lives are run. And then she uses these photos as reference images to make charcoal sketches and then preparatory drawings and studies before ultimately freehanding the final painted version. As you can see, she's not a realist painter. There's definitely kind of a sketchier painterly quality to these works. But I think due to this process and her familiarity and closeness with her subjects and with the scene that she intends to depict, they certainly feel very authentic. And a subject that she explores very often is parenthood and child raising. So that's really kind of central to these two works here. Specifically, she explores the many roles that go into child raising. As I mentioned, she did create a series of works of daycares and the people working in the daycares and the children, which are really lovely. But these two works here actually depict her own child, Laurie. Again, it's sort of these two different stages, infanthood, and then a little bit further along, but still very much a baby. Interestingly, the adult subject here is not the artist or even anyone in her immediate family. Instead, the caregiver that's depicted here, Sarah, is a home health aide. And this is a role that is, I think, common throughout the United Kingdom, but as she's described it, Scotland sort of has its own system that's very much ingrained into the healthcare system there. And this role is someone that will actually check in with the family, both with the mother and the baby, from infancy up through when the child is 5 years old and entering the school system. And it's the same aide the whole time. So it is someone who is sort of forming some kind of relationship with the family, some kind of relationship with the child. And the idea is that it's sort of this well-being role. After a child enters a school system, there are people outside the immediate family that are seeing the child and sort of checking in with them on a day-to-day basis. But until that time, it's, a period that I think can feel for a parent very isolating, when the, sort of entirety of responsibility for caring for your child is placed on you. Um, and it's also often very insular and kind of just with immediate family, and of course, often falls to the mother in that role. And one of the things that this aid will do is not only check on the child, but also kind of check on the home life and check on the mother and sort of offer support and help if needed, which I think is a really incredible resource. It's not something that we really have here in the US. Um, but with these portraits, I think you can really kind of see the care that, both this caregiver, Sarah, is putting into her time with this baby in the work on the left. They're both titled Sarah weighing Laurie. In the work on the left, you can see that the little tiny infant is on a baby scale. It looks like maybe she's about to put a diaper on him. In the work on the right, it looks more like she's dressing him, maybe, but you can really kind of see the care and familiarity that she has with the child. And then I think as well through the portrait, you can see the care and familiarity that Walker has with this woman as well. Um, and I think it's a role that is not often depicted in portraits and in works of art, but it really does exemplify the kind of many hands that go into raising children. They say it takes a village, and I think this is a great example of that. Interestingly, if you could go to the next slide, Gabby, here you can see in the detail, one of the parts of the background of this painting is a little kind of half sliver of a mirror. And you can see in the detail that Walker has actually depicted herself in the reflection holding up a camera. So it's this sort of sneaky self-portrait that, not only reflects this idea of caregiving and, multiple types of caregiving, but I think it also really kind of perfectly exemplifies this idea of being a working mother, and the fact that she's depicted herself in this image of her child, not in her role as a mother, but in her role as an artist, is a very interesting choice. And it's kind of adds to this power and our sense of all of the people in this family's life. If you can move to the next slide, the next work that I'll be speaking about is this work by Laurie Simmons titled Lying House from her Lying Objects series. This is probably the most kind of literal and on the nose depiction of this homemaker theme. As you can see, it is a photograph of a model house with legs sticking out of it. Simmons is a key figure of the pictures generation, which is a group of artists who are mostly women who emerged in the late 70s and 80s. They were mostly photographers and mixed media artists, working within the theme of media, how we receive media, and often doing a lot of photo collage, and kind of playing with reality and staged reality. And many of these artists were working sort of as a counterpoint to the more male-dominated fields of sculpture and painting. I use quotes there because, of course, women were working in these fields as well. But I think there was this idea that they were very dominated by these big male artist personalities. But many of these artists, including Simmons, were exploring new approaches to photography, including these elaborately staged or constructed images and subjects. And Simmons's work certainly employs these sort of eerie or unsettling props. Her work is on view right now as well in the exhibition Uncanny, which Irene curated. And it definitely has that kind of uncanny valley feel to it. She's often using dolls and other found objects. And part of this is that she's sort of playing with this consumer-oriented society that was emerging in the 70s and 80s, while also playing with this idea of a kind of packaged life. Her upbringing was on Long Island. She was born in 1949, and she spent her childhood in what she has described as a cookie cutter neighborhood that was sort of popping up post World War II, during a period of greater economic expansion and then also kind of heightened consumerism, that, for Simmons at least, said sort of created this impulse for conformity. So she said, this is a quote, "The idea of an object with legs that could dance or move was always very intriguing to me." And so you see her quite a lot in her work combining found objects with the legs or arms or other body parts of dolls. In earlier works, she often was staging these sort of scenes with dolls in doll houses using toys and props. So they became these sort of miniature imagined spaces where these domestic dramas could play out. She created scenes of, these little kind of dolls of women organizing pantries, running a bath, cleaning in these, kind of manufactured, sort of perfect spaces of a fake dollhouse. Um, and this work, which again comes from her Lying Objects series, is a bit later. And you can see here she's actually pairing the dollhouse and using it to sort of almost crush this figure. Um, Other works in the Lying Objects series pair objects like perfume bottles and small cakes or little bonbons or things like that. I think here with this house, it feels very on the nose for exploring this theme. You can kind of see and feel this crushing weight of homemaking and, this kind of crushing weight that I think many women in the 50s, 60s, and beyond felt, being kind of tied to domestic duties and tied to the house. Um, and then, of course, there's also this sort of implication of women as objects. So here the woman actually kind of becomes the house with the legs emerging from it. Um, so it's certainly very on the nose for this. And then the last work that I'll share, I know we're kind of getting close to the end here, but this is a work by Ursula von Ruddingsvard, titled Apron. I'm sure that many are familiar with von Ruddingsvard's work. We had an exhibition at NMWA called The Contour of Feeling in 2019, I think. But she is an artist who was born in Germany to Polish and Ukrainian parents. And she spent much of her early childhood moving between displacement camps for refugees in Germany following World War II, before she eventually moved to the United States when she was about 9 years old. And she's really known for creating these often very large scale wooden sculptures. They're usually abstract. Her work is not autobiographical, but it does usually relate to her own feelings and her own life experiences and sort of a way of working through emotions. So I saw an interview recently where she said she grew up in a home with very few words. And so she kind of came to understand the world and her circumstances through more visual means, which I think certainly translates in her sculpture. But one of the reasons that I wanted to include her work in this section is that um, really kind of to address this incorrect assumption that women work on a smaller scale or with more delicate materials. Um, Sculpture was historically a more difficult field for women to enter or gain recognition in, due to a lack of access to training, materials, space to create. And then also, I think these sort of lingering ideas of masculinity related to sculpture, especially in the mid to late 19th century. Um, this work, Apron, I would say is relatively small for von Ruddingsvard. This one you can see it's about like 4-ish feet tall, and about 2 feet wide. Many of her works are like 10 plus feet tall, rising up from the floor, some emerging from the wall, even on a larger scale than that. And so the process for creating them is very physical and rigorous. She has to wear this sort of full body protective suit and masks to protect against the sawdust as she's carving these works. She's using this electronic circle saw, heavy machinery to lift things in place. Um, and she works in a very intuitive way. So much of her work is created in layers. This one I think is not, but as she's kind of carving and sculpting into the wood, she's um, working very intuitively to create these forms. And then the darker part that you can see on this is graphite. Once she has sawed the work and kind of carved into it, she's covering it with graphite, and that makes it a little bit darker. Um, with this sort of intuitive approach to her work, she has said that it doesn't necessarily have any one meaning, although the titles are often sort of evocative of things in her life. With this one, Apron, both the title and the form, I think, are very suggestive, oh my gosh, of an object, an apron, one that is often associated with domestic work, and I think something that is more often worn by women if you think of cooking and cleaning. Like Simmons' work, I think this piece conveys a lot of weight, whether it's emotional weight or the physical weight of the work. But in this context, I think we can definitely consider the weight of responsibilities that sort of build up in the domestic sphere, as well as the emotional burden of managing all of that. Um, but also for von Redingsvard herself, in her early childhood, growing up in these displacement camps, she's described living in these entirely wooden barracks. So everything was raw wood. She said that the floor was raw wood, the ceilings were raw wood, the walls, sort of everything. And so she felt very kind of surrounded by that and enclosed by that, I think, in growing up. So it's sort of interesting in this context as well that this is a material that, for her personally, is very intrinsic to her earliest memories of home or space that she was living as well. So I know we're kind of right at 7, so I can wrap that up. But of course, if anyone has questions, we're happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Really appreciate that. And thank you to Aureen and Jenny. Those were amazing presentations. Always love hearing from you all about the works that are on view in our exhibitions. To all of our attendees, I know we're at time, so if you need to leave and hop off, feel free to. We really appreciate you being here. But if you can stick around a little longer, if you have questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A feature and we will answer them as fast as we can so we don't keep you around for too long. But so far we have one question in the chat. It is the apron piece made of separate wooden pieces laminated together, or is it one solid piece of wood? Yes, this is for Hannah.
That's a good question. I don't think that the entirety is one piece of wood, but I do think that the bit that's hanging, sort of like hanging down which is a little bit different than how von Rodingsvard often works in her floor pieces. They're very layered, and she's described kind of creating like an outline or a stencil of the shape of the base and then kind of building it up from there. I don't know how her exact process for creating this piece that hangs a bit more, but in person, it doesn't look like it has that layered quality to me.
Yeah. Right. And then do we have any other questions? I know I just answered this one, but this program will be uploaded to YouTube in the coming weeks. We have a bit of a backlog of virtual programs that haven't made it up there yet, but they will be there and we'll announce it in e-news. So please, stay tuned. And then I have a question about one of the artists that Jenny spoke about. Jackie, which artist were you thinking about, if you want to follow up in the chat or in the Q&A feature?
I can just name them all really quickly, if that's
Yes, that
helpful.
works.
So I spoke about Latoya Hobbs, who did the woodblock painting collage. I spoke about Pasita Abad, who did the large abstract painting, and I spoke about Claude Regay Hurst, who did the still life.
You appreciate that, Jenny. And we can, it's easier. We can also add those names to the chat so you have easy access to that as well. Do we have any other questions from our attendees today? And then we have one about Latoya Hobbs. Is she working in additions with her woodblock prints?
That's actually a very good question. I don't know. I would assume so, as prints are usually done in editions, but I don't know for sure.
And for the recording, it will be on our YouTube channel. Often that's where we share them, and I will just drop that link in the chat so you can see some of our older virtual program recordings and also some of our in-person public programs as well. And Jackie, no worries, but yes, it was Claude, and her name is in the chat as well. But thank you. Righty. And okay, if there aren't any more questions, I will move into closing remarks. Right. So again, thank you everyone for joining us for today's virtual program. I hope you'll visit us soon and see some of these works in person. And then I just ask you all to mark your calendar for our next virtual program. Oops, that's actually not our next one. We have one prior to that. Curator's Perspective, Guerrilla Girls. Hannah, who's here tonight, she'll be presenting on our one of our newest exhibitions, Guerrilla Girls Making Trouble, on June 25th at 6 p.m. We'll send an invitation or in early June, and but it's already on the website. If you want to go ahead and register, would love to have you. And then in July, we'll have another virtual program with for a radical alteration, another new exhibition currently on view with our director of the library, Elizabeth Ajunwa, and the exhibition curator, Maimuna Farhad. Then we have a few other upcoming programs and events. Most of these are all in person, but there will be another virtual program hosted by our amazing education department on Friday, May 23rd. It'll be an art chat all about uncanny. So I hope you can join us for that. And then also, as another reminder, our virtual program recordings are on YouTube. So feel free to check out the different programs we have, from Fresh Talks, Creatives Keynotes, things about our 5 Women Artists campaign, all there. This program will be uploaded in the coming weeks, so look out probably later in June. We just have to make sure the video is captioned properly, and then we'll get it up ready for you all. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I hope to see you at another virtual program in the coming months and weeks, and I hope you have a great Wednesday evening for folks on the West Coast or East Coast, and then enjoy the rest of your afternoon for people who are the West Coast. But yeah, thank you again so much. We really appreciate you all being here, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.